So we're going to bring on Meg in just a second. Meg, if you, I know you can hear this, so I'm going to, as I discussed before, you're going to disappear and then you're going to come back and join us. So don't be alarmed when you get cut off. It's because we are promoting you. So give us just a second. And again, as she joins us, and here she is, as she gets settled. Hey, Meg.
Hello.
How's it going?
I'm 2 cups of coffee in for what promises to be a very long day. So
A
that's
very
always
long
a
day.
good
Yeah.
sign.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, at least there's no news dropping of like lawsuits or anything where you
Say
need.
that now.
I know. I should. I
Don't
should.
jinx me.
I shouldn't tempt anything. So everyone, Meg Linehan works for The Athletic. She's a writer. She has a podcast, which is awesome. You guys should subscribe to that as well. When it comes to women's soccer Twitter and just women's soccer news and soccer news in general, she is one of the must follows. Again, writes for The Athletic. Meg, thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
This is one of the first times we've kind of had something on here, so we appreciate you taking time out of a busy Sunday to join us.
I mean, honestly, until the game starts, it was really just like drink coffee, take the dog outside. This was kind of like I got yesterday afternoon off for the first time in a while. And then I was like, oh, maybe I can sleep in because I know like I'm going to be working until 9-10 o'clock at night tonight. And then the dog decided to wake up at 8 o'clock in the morning. And I was like, okay, so
Yeah.
cool. Thanks.
Dogs don't have clocks. We love them, but they don't have clocks. Their
8 o'clock is kind of late for a dog, but all right.
She actually is the laziest. Like she will sleep forever generally if you let her. Like usually we have to wake her up. So she is not a standard dog in the morning, but this morning not her usual work. She was just staring at me from her spot across the room like, hello. And I was just like, okay, all right, that's fine.
Does your dog have a favorite player?
That's a good question. I mean, I feel like all dogs probably have to default to Rose Lavelle just because of her love of dogs. I mean, Steph Young got her with the dog question this week in media availability. And of course, it's only Rose Lavelle that's like, yes, so now that I've moved to England, the first friend I've made outside of the team is a dog walker in Manchester who lets me pet the dogs. And I was like, this checks out.
Yeah,
1000%.
Every box. Yeah. So we want to talk about the team in general, and we'll kind of bring it back down to the game today. But again, one thing I told you that we will not answer. Sorry, Hannah. We will not answer any questions, obtain any questions about the NWSL schedule. We're giving you a break on that. You get that everywhere else. You won't get that.
I never actually know.
I know.
And then Lisa, of course, the commissioner of the NWSL goes, we'll have the schedule in the coming days. And I was like, well, first of all, I know for a fact that's not going to be true. But second of all, why would you do this to me? And then now she's extremely active on Twitter. And so now she's starting to joke about, and I was just like, thanks. Cool.
Yeah. See, you get it everywhere else. You're not going to get that here. We're going to talk. We'll talk about the NWSL, just not the schedule today. We know some things, but I did want to start just big picture, looking at this women's national team. What do you think? Like, it has many strengths, but what do you think is the biggest strength that they're going to lean on this year, especially this year in a busy year where they've gone from relative inactivity for 10 months to now having game after game after game leading up to the Olympics?
I mean, I think this goes back to the way that we talked about this team in the 2019 World Cup, but the depth of this team is still, I think, their strongest thing, right? Like you can cycle people in and out of a starting 11. And I do think that Vlatko Andonovski is a little more willing to say, this team is going to ask certain things of us. So I'm going to plug a different person into the starting 11 to specifically address the weaknesses of the team that we're playing, right? Like, yes, he's gotten more consistent, I think, a little bit compared to early on where there was a little bit more experimentation. But I think as we're starting to kind of see some congestion, like you have the ability to opt for other players. And I mean I just remember Ali Krieger making a comment in a mix zone in France where she was just like, you could put the B team, right, the B team of the US women's national team in this World Cup and they would make it extremely far in this tournament. That is still the case, if not more so now. Like, it is just absurd, the amount of depth. And the fact that we're talking about why isn't Macario starting, and she's literally like a couple of games into her tenure as a national team player, You know, like we can kind of see where it's going for her, but the fact that we're already having that conversation again only speaks to the development that happens on this team and the depth that happens with this team. So I think that's something that, you know, the question becomes of how much do you actually utilize it, but that is still, out of all of the like many good things, the fact that we've got essentially 4 people trying to fit into 3 starting midfielder spots, right? Between Horan, Lavelle, Nwsl, and Ertz, the fact that we've never figured out what path actually gets all 4 of those players on the, like, that's the U.S. Women's National Team in a nutshell, and it's that depth. And that, again, it helped in the 2019 World Cup. It also helps, I think, the most in the training environment, but in a much tighter tournament like the Olympics, yes, you're down to 18 players, but that versatility and that depth, again, gives them such a huge edge.
And conversely, like they're the best team on the planet for us, but they're not the perfect team. I mean, as you see, they struggled the other night against Canada. They've struggled in the past. Even if they win, it's not always pretty. And I think that's to their testament. But what is an area that you think is of concern that, like, I mean, obviously they're good at everything, but is there something that you're like, hey, they may need to tinker with this or kind of tighten this up before they go to Japan?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting because that game against Canada, right? Like, I feel like we almost overreacted because when they came back in November against the Netherlands and they just cruised, right? That was a game that I think a lot of us were looking at as kind of like a write-off, like they just need to get back on the field, we see what happens. But then because they looked so head and shoulders good, and then you have a couple games against Colombia where you really get to like put those pieces together, right? We're used to seeing this team in January and February, even into March, like only just starting to gel. And so because we've actually taken that step back, I think there was kind of this panic of like, oh no, there's stuff wrong. But also I think it's just kind of part of the way that this team naturally tends to like start to come together, right? Like they need time together at the start of the year to make it look as good as it looks. But I mean, even going back to, I think about that Spain game a lot, right? That was not a pretty win. That was not, and that's also part of the DNA of this team, is that they cannot necessarily have 100% of what should be going on, and they're still able to get results. But that's not unusual for this team either, right? And that's kind of a thing that I think we almost kind of lost sight of, that there have been results that have not looked guaranteed or have not looked great, but they are still getting results. And that has consistently happened throughout the years. But I also think that expectations have been so high in the Andonovsky era that we kind of forgot about that part of the team a little bit. And so I think, I think it's a good reminder for us all to take a little step back and be like, we can expect perfection, right? We can expect kind of what we should be seeing from the number 1 ranked team in the world, right? And what they're trying to work on under Andonovsky, but also knowing that sometimes it's just not going to be there. And that is not a sign of like, oh, okay, you need to like completely break everything up, because that's not what is happening at all. And that's why I think Brazil is going to be such an interesting game, because I think as hard as Canada pushed them, I have much higher expectations of Brazil to push them in ways they have not seen in a while.
To that end, Meg, and we've got, maybe 3 minutes or 9 minutes or however till the lineup drops.
Yeah.
Do you have any
We'll find out.
Well, we'll find out. We're ready. We're on standby.
Yeah.
Do you think that the starting lineup is going? Well, we were talking about this before you came on. Like, do you think that maybe Vlatko had an idea who was going to start in this game before the tournament even started? Or do you think it's going to be more reactionary to how things went on Thursday against the Canadians?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would bet that he already had an idea heading into this tournament of, I just think Brazil is the most interesting challenge of these 3 teams, and is a team that is going to both have the physicality, but also the creativity. And I think is going to highlight some of the potential issues on the back line, or stuff that just needs to get tightened up, right? I don't want to call them issues necessarily. It's just like, is the communication there? And so Midge Purce getting the start, right, against Canada, that is 1000% an investment into getting her meaningful minutes. And that has always been kind of the struggle of this team, is you're trying to develop players And part of that is not just happening at training, it is getting them minutes against stronger and stronger competition and building them and making sure that they are getting time at that level in order to then face even tougher competition, right?
Sure.
So I do think that there's probably a working starting 11 before this tournament even happened to face off against Brazil. I mean, I personally would be, part of the problem too is that obviously injuries are playing a role as well. Like the fact that Kelly O'Hara is not at 100%, like I would assume that she would be starting in this game otherwise, and that might not be the case. So again, like you are getting development just because of the circumstances you're in, but I think Brazil is one of those games that's probably getting the like little tag of, oh no, this is getting our 100% as I view it, starting 11.
Right on. And you actually asked one of our first member questions without even knowing it. So that was whether O'Hara's, how she's recovering.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't gotten a huge amount of updates on her, just in terms of, it did not sound like it was something wildly serious. It was just kind of, and I also think Andonovski has been a little more willing to back off players who just need a little extra time, right? Like, I mean, we're going to have a lot of jokes about known quantities or not, right? Like, there's definitely a question about Ashlyn Harris, right? But like, you don't have to, what Kelly O'Hara does in that role for this team. And if you can not necessarily, first of all, you don't have to sacrifice her recovery. And then you also get the benefit of potentially getting someone like Midge Purce significant development minutes. Like, to him, like, the result is one thing, and the expectations on this team and of this team are that they're always going to win, but there are also still bigger goals that you have to contend with, rather than just like, SheBelieves Cup is a tournament, right? And they do care about the results, but like, if you're going to get a player that might play a much larger role on this team good minutes ahead of a major international tournament, or on the way to thinking about what you're going to do over the next cycle for 2023, sometimes it's worth it.
So Meg, we have a question in the chat from Chris, and he asks, do you see Vlatko heading to the Olympics with only 4 dedicated midfielders? He mentions Lavelle, or Mewis, Sammy Mewis, and Haran, knowing that he can use other players in that role, or do you think he brings a 5th? And he mentions Christy Mewis.
Yeah, I think that's going to be, I'm very fascinated to see how the breakdown is going to be. Like, I went back and looked at older Olympic rosters for an article once, just to be like, what is the breakdown between defenders, midfielders, forwards, right? And you can't use that to necessarily try to predict. My only thought is, and again, like, I'm not Vlatko. I'm not nearly as smart as Vlatko. Vlatko is in his own little universe. I'm only trying to figure out how to keep up with him, right? Like, I personally would bring the extra midfielder instead of the extra forward. And that is because if something goes terribly drastically wrong, I would rather have that backup midfielder than anything else. And I also think Christy Mewis has really shown what she can do off of the bench, and she presents a different element to this U.S. Women's National Team game. Like, and so if you need to turn something around in the second half, I think Christy Mewis has shown a few times now, like, there is a real significant difference when she comes on the field for the second half. So if I'm looking at that, I would say in my head, yeah, it makes more sense, right? And you have Crystal Dunn, like, if Midge Purce makes this roster too, right? Like, you have, again, the versatility of this team where you could slot Crystal Dunn in at the midfield on the forward line.
Does Julie have an understudy right now, do you think? We had this question in 2019, and I'm bringing it up again now.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of Andy Sullivan for a while. And now, I mean, I think Andy Sullivan is still certainly in that conversation, right? I mean, in 2019, ahead of the World Cup, it was really like, oh, does McCall Zerboni make this roster? Does Andy Sullivan make this roster? As having like that direct understudy backup, defensive midfielder type. And now it is a little less clear, I think. I mean, I think Andy Sullivan is certainly still in the conversation for the U.S. Women's National Team, but I also think that is probably we're going to put a pin in it conversation until post-Olympics, and then the quest becomes, okay, I personally I love defensive midfielders for no reason. They have always consistently been some of my favorite players. Like I think about Leslie Osborne for both the national team and the Boston Breakers and what she used to do on the field. Shannon Box is another one, right? And like having that kind of player for the national team, I think is extremely important, but also I think we talk a lot about certain players like maybe potentially eventually shifting off of this team, right? And Julie Ertz is still one of those ones where I'm like, oh, it has like we do maybe need to think about where that team goes next in that role. But I think that's kind of we're going to figure that out over the next cycle question.
So I'm getting reports that the
let's take a look at the app.
Roster is out. So I'm just trying to bring it up real quick. But while we're waiting, I wanted to ask.
Jane.
Do you have it?
Jane is starting.
There we go.
Oh wait, or is this just the roster? This is just lineup.
Yes,
That's it's Nair. It's Nair.
Okay.
Yeah, so Nair, Sonnet, Dahlkemper, Sauerbrunn, Dunn, Ertz, Haran, Lavelle, Williams, Morgan Press.
Williams, Morgan Press. Okay. So it seems like the triple sub, if you will, from Thursday is now starting this game. So that makes sense. And it seems like we lost Carly Lloyd out of the lineup. It looks like Rapinoe, I think, is out.
Yep.
And then we didn't even talk about Emily Sonnet earlier when we were talking about Kelly O'Hara.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Sonnet is another one of those players where they're trying to figure out in terms of her versatility, like center back is a possibility as a backup potential, outside back, right? Which side? Like she's a player that's kind of bounced wherever they need to put her in. But I think this is definitely a really good test to see where Sonnet's at today.
She's got Marta, doesn't she? By all accounts.
She could be tasked with Marta, which
I'm presuming Marta's starting, but
yeah, I mean,
if Marta doesn't start, that would be a shot.
Yeah, that feels like a safe bet today.
Yeah. Really quickly, while we were talking about the team at large, you were mentioning putting a pen for post-Olympics discussion. And right now, there's a lot of young players that are in this camp. There's a lot of that are just on the fringe of this camp, and then there's some that are just coming up. If you look at what happened in the NWSL draft just a few weeks ago. So a question from our godfather, Justin, the co-founder, he asked, who do you think is a women's national team superstar that's in the coming that we may not have eyes on yet, or we may not really fully be focused on, but you think has the tools to be mentioned along the best in the world?
I am really looking forward to Brianna Pinto in the NWSL. And granted, I've talked to her a fair amount in terms of interviews, but I think that Brianna Pinto could potentially be like a really important piece moving forward for the team itself, but like everything that she does off of the field is, I mean, she as a relative old, right? Like she feels so extremely put together. She is ready. As soon as she steps into a professional setting, right? And obviously she's very important for UNC right at the moment, but as soon as she steps into a professional setting, she's just, I don't have a lot of questions about her adjusting to that next level. And then I think then it becomes okay, are you getting more consistent call-ups, right? Like she has been in the national team youth system, right? She is now on the advisory council for the U.S. Soccer Athletes Council, right? Mm-hmm. So she's got kind of both the on the field and the off the field attributes. And there's, I think, only one player that I think I've ever really thought that, being at the college draft for NWSL, I remember talking to Midge Purse for the first time and being like, she's ready. Mm-hmm. And it's the same exact reaction. So Brianna Pinto is really one of those players where I'm just like, I'm really ready to see what she does next and to see her try to make her way into the national team picture in a much more consistent way.
Yeah, she's had a few caps. I guess I want to say her first cap was Jill Ellis's last match, or one of her last.
Yeah, this is the stuff I do not retain at all because I know I can look it up.
Right. Yeah, but she was there right around when Ellis departed and Andonovski came in. She was kind of in a couple of those camps, and then focused on finishing up at UNC, and now, like you said, the number 3 pick in the NWSL draft to Sky Blue. So that'll be interesting. Her and Midge Purce pairing up. I don't like that as a Spirit fan, but as a soccer fan, we should all be pretty excited about that. Look into today. What do you see is going to be what do you think? How do you think the U.S. should attack Brazil? I mean, you mentioned Marta and just who would be assigned to her, but then there's also Debinha, who was just causing fits the other day for Argentina.
Mm-hmm.
So,
mm-hmm.
and she's one of these known commodities that we've known. She's become, one of the best players in the world as well. How do you stop a two-headed attack where it's going to come from both sides, and also there's their supporting cast who is just as good?
Right. I mean, I think it's really interesting. So I actually just wrote a big story about Debinha because I think that she still somehow is underrated still within the NWSL and also the international soccer world, right? I think it's really interesting because Brazil uses her in a different way than North Carolina does, right? Like for North Carolina, she's just basically given freedom of field, whereas currently in Brazil's setup, she's basically used as a forward, like in a 2 front, right? So she's making runs that. So I actually asked Vlatko Andonovski, like, how do you, what are you looking for from Debinha, right? And it's just like her movement is going to be like exactly what we need, right, to figure out where the weaknesses still are. So, I mean, in previous kind of more recent versions of this matchup, these have been really wide open games. Like it's basically 2 teams just kind of throwing haymakers at each other. And so I think just what I'm looking for is, can the US kind of rein that in, right? Can you Vlatko Andonovski talks a lot about, we want to control the game the entire time, whether we are in possession of the ball or the other team has the ball. And so when Paul Riley's out here talking about, when Debinha first got to the United States, she would dribble herself into dark alleys and not necessarily know how to get herself out. And so it's forcing Brazil to make those sorts of bad decisions, right? To opt for trying to beat someone one-on-one with the dribble rather than finding the pass that's going to open up space. And so it's forcing those bad decisions. And that's really what I'm going to be looking for in terms of, are they making the right calls in these one-on-one battles to reduce options and to reduce their creativity, which is kind of a hard thing to watch for, but it's really just, can you knock them off of their game enough where they're not making the right decision or they're rushing their decision and thus creating turnovers for you to take advantage of and to hit them back in transition. And that's really, like, again, Vlatko Andonovski talks so much about wanting to control, especially when the other team has the ball. So that's really, I think, my big focus is, how much are they controlling them?
So Jacob was kind enough to tweet or put out the lineup here. Just for those of you out there who can't read it, it's Barbara, Kathleen, Bruna, Rafael, Tamires, Andressa, Debinha, Marta, who is the captain, obviously, Beatrice, Andresina, and Ludmila. So it's just, I think, if I recall correctly, that's basically the exact same lineup that they tried out against Argentina. No changes whatsoever. So you can kind of, if you saw that game, you can kind of get a glimpse of how they're going to try and attack. One thing I did note, and I know you're on the media availabilities whenever they have them. A couple weeks ago, Andonovski was definitely talking about how they like to employ a high press, that he didn't think that he wanted to dial it back, but he knows that the players are so competitive that there's just not a lot of opportunity to do so. It didn't seem like they did any dialing back of anything against Canada. But when you have a creative team, especially in the middle, that can kind of mix it up, do you think that is something that we should look for? Or is that something where you think it doesn't matter the opponent, we're going to learn that our high press is going to we'll just fit it into whatever we're being given?
I mean, I honestly, when I see Lynn Williams start, I'm like, well, the high press is happening, right? Like that to me is such a clear sign, because I think that, like, I know people really don't like Lynn Williams finishing, but her value in Vlatko Andonovski's system is what she does on the high press and her defensive work, right? Like, bringing it back to Debinha again for a second, I mean, Paul Riley was joking to me, like, when Debinha realized the higher up on the field the team causes a turnover and the less she has to work in order to transition into the attack, like, it's less running if we win the ball further upfield, right? It's the same thing And so Lynn Williams to me has always been that signal of like, that's exactly what I want. And so I do think that Lynn Williams does a lot of not super glamorous work in this system. And that is always the sign of, no, we're probably going to be pressing a lot in this game.
So I want to shift to the NWSL. Again, those of you in the chat, no questions about the schedule, but I did want to focus on this upcoming season. So I feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, the NWSL we've seen a lot of growth. We have Racing Louisville coming in this year. We have Angel City and Sacramento next year. The Spirit added 430 new owners.
Yeah.
I think they're still announcing them as we speak. They're just reading a laundry list of people. So you see some evidence of growth, but you also see like Utah move to Kansas City. So how do you so people may think of that as instability, which is unfair, but it's just kind of lack of a better word. So what do you make of all the changes that the league has gone through in this offseason? And how does that translate into what we see as growth?
Yeah. I mean, it is growing. Also, I mean, this is kind of the joke, right? Of growing pains. Mm-hmm. That's really a part of it for the league, right? Like, I mean, for NWSL, as someone who's been around since legit day one, right? I mean, I think about what day one, or even that first championship that was in Western New York, Portland Thorns versus the Western New York Flash, and like how small that game felt. Like you had, I don't know, 20, 25, maybe a few more Thorns fans travel. It was just such a kind of small thing, right? And to think about where we're at now in terms of the league, and part of that is just, I think also, you know, the growth of women's soccer in this country has never just been like this nice linear progression of like everything feels safe all of the time. And there are people who are still involved in the sport that are not going to be able to keep up if the growth keeps happening at that same rate. And there are also people who have been involved historically in women's soccer who have been kind of, I want to say like strange bedfellows, but like, I think we're now starting to ask the question of, do we need their support now? Mm-hmm. And Deloy Hansen is a really good example of that, because Deloy Hansen came into the league in a time of great instability and was viewed as kind of the savior of the NWSL for an extended amount of time. And then we saw kind of what the price of that was. And so the NWSL now has the ability to say that is not a price that we are willing to pay, whether that's in what we actually accept or what our supporters have deemed unacceptable. Mm-hmm. And then you have an ownership group coming in with Angie and Chris Long, who have as deep pockets, if not deeper, who have been brought into the fold essentially by Angel City ownership, right? Like, I think we're starting to see kind of that shift into the next phase of ownership. But also, I mean, one of the delightful things about the way that the NWSL has grown too is that they have finally figured out that, you know, looking at the Washington Spirit, right? Looking at Angel City's ownership groups, these big groups of people coming in, they're not paying a huge amount when they're investing in teams. Or the Washington Spirit have a structure for that new owner. They're not technically owners, they're investors. And that is a difference. It's kind of semantics, but like, they're not paying $1 million to buy into the Washington Spirit. Essentially, the NWSL has now convinced people to pay them to be influencers for their team, which is wild. The fact that is now happening. Like, hey, can you give us money and then you get to come to this game and you get to post social media posts about our team? Like, that's what they're paying for right at the moment. And so it is really interesting. And again, like, we're again not doing this without growth pains. I mean, Angel City just announced a huge major sponsorship with DoorDash to be their front jersey sponsors. And then there's kind of immediately a question about labor practices. Right. So you like, NWSL is trying to figure out some of these growth pains of expectations are kind of in one space, but like what actually it takes to survive is in another. And so you're starting to see some of that navigation of, and I won't get into my like, what do we accept out of capitalism speech, but like know that that's what we're essentially dealing with is what does it take to survive? What are we willing to put up with? And what space can we actually occupy kind of in this larger space? But when it comes to the actual growth of the NWSL, I mean, like, we are now in a completely different stratosphere than where we were when it first started. I mean, a sponsor of the NWSL used to be the National Mango Board.
I remember that.
Like, they had mangoes outside of Providence Park.
Yeah.
In that lobby. Hey, so Ebony's coming in with a bit of a haymaker, and I want to get it out of the way.
Yeah.
All of the personnel shifting that's happened in the league in the past few months. Prediction: top 4 playoffs.
Well, first of all, 6 teams now qualify for the playoffs, which is a thing that I literally struggle to remember every single time. But top 4, I mean, I personally have very high expectations for Portland this season. I think Chicago's still going to be in the mix. I'm not willing to write off North Carolina. I know Ebony is obviously a North Carolina person. Again, if Dabini is on that team and Lynn Williams is on that team, like, I'm still going to rank them as a real contender. Denise O'Sullivan too. Again, if you want to talk about underrated players in the NWSL, Denise O'Sullivan honestly might be at the top of that list. And then, like, you just get these bands of teams, right? Where, like, I have kind of like known, like, they're definitely going to be contenders, and Portland and Chicago, I think, are up there. Washington Spirit, they're gunning for a playoff spot. I do fully expect them to make it into the playoff position by the end of the year. And after that, like, I want to like what OL Reign is doing. I don't know what OL Reign is doing. Like, and they've been kind of that consistent, like, at least fighting for a playoff spot, right? And I just am going, like, in theory, I guess it might work. But they're kind of definitely in my big question mark box. And so I think after, does OL Reign know what they're doing? Also a valid question.
Wait,
so, you know, like,
along those lines, do you think that changes? Do you think their prospect changes if the rumors that we're hearing about possibly Wendy Renard joining the league and joining OL Reign, do you think that changes things? Or if you think that Roosevelt comes back from Man City and joins them since they have her rights, do you think that changes things a bit?
I mean, I do think it depends a bit on what personnel they get. I've heard kind of conflicting things about Wendy coming over. I kind of don't think that she is going to end up being one of the players. I might be pleasantly surprised because I think that's a huge get for the Reign. But, you know, if it is Sarah Buhadi coming over, like, does that necessarily change Reign's, like, overall prospects? I don't super think so. Like, you need, like, if Marzan is one of the players coming over or Wendy Renard is one of the players coming over, that makes a big difference. If Lavelle does end up coming back to the United States, and Reign can convince her that that is the right spot for her to be, then again, that's a big difference. But as it stands right now, in the still very early days of the longest NWSL preseason ever, that is going to last 2 years in and out of itself, so far, like, I don't see a plan necessarily that ends with them significantly pushing for, like, going far in the playoffs as of right now.
And we've seen, you know, a lot more consumption of women's soccer, not just NWSL. I mean, I think it was like, 200,000 people were watching Mexico, Costa Rica yesterday or something. And then you have the French league, the Spanish league,
out of football coming in and actually making stuff accessible. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, how does that change the game? And are there teams now that, of course, we also support NWSL, but are there teams abroad where you say, hey, you know, this is actually more available to watch than you may think, you should tune in and watch them?
I mean, I am really personally excited to be able to watch some Lyon games and see Catarina Macario play for Lyon. Like, that is a really great thing that we can actually kind of, like, keep tabs on her and her development now and not have to. I'm certainly too old to try to figure out illegal streams. Like, if someone sends it to me, great. If not, I'm just not watching that game. So, like, I need help at this point. But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, fundamentally we saw, and like, I'm sure, Donald, you're especially familiar with my frustration at the narrative of because players are going over to play in England that the NWSL is dead, right? Or because Caterina Macario went to Lyon, the NWSL is dead, which is not the case. And fundamentally, both England and France like don't compete with the NWSL really at all in terms of time frame, right? Like maybe we get a game or two in overlap in terms of like a weekend game or something, but like you can watch WSL at 7:30 o'clock in the morning and then go to an NWSL game later. They're also on opposite schedules. So they're not truly competing for viewers' attention, I would argue. And if you are an NWSL supporter, you can easily then start turning your attention to WSL and just adding more women's soccer to your viewership diet. That's a good thing, right? That's a good thing for the growth of the game overall, and certainly not like a panic, doom and gloom kind of thing. It's also, as I keep saying, an invitation for the NWSL to really start taking these challenges seriously. And the bigger thing is not necessarily worrying about a couple of players going over. The question becomes, do they come back, right? But also, are you taking seriously the fact that teams in England, especially, but also Lyon, right? Lyon is always going to be its own thing. But teams in England have the brand, right? There's an appeal of Champions League. There are a lot of factors that would want a player would want to go over there, right? And every player has to make that decision for themselves. And it shouldn't be about an obligation of I need to grow the game or whatever. I think that all that stuff should get thrown out the window. If it's going to make you a better player, you should go where you want to go. But NWSL in particular has to take more seriously that facilities have to get better, that player experiences have to get better, right? Like Louisville actually hiring a person to take care of the player experience at their club. The fact that they're building facilities like that, like that's where the work really is, I think, ahead for the NWSL of ensuring that it is a destination for players that they feel confident that their game is going to get better.
Yeah, I know the Spirit they basically are joining DC United, even though DC United doesn't own them. They will be sharing facilities once that facility is built. They just broke ground on it a few weeks ago. It should be done by the end of the summer. But I think one thing I want to end with NWSL is a lot of people in here are from cities that don't have NWSL but may want NWSL. Where do you see expansion going when it comes to? It seems to be methodical, which is good. And we can't say the same for MLS and even USL at times. But it seems like they're being more methodical. So where do you think the next wave of their growth is going to come from?
I mean, I think what has always been most important for the NWSL and has not always gone 100% to plan has been the ownership group. Like, do they know what they're getting into? Do they know the amount of investment that's going to be required, right? And right at the moment, I do think that the NWSL is kind of like this appealing investment opportunity because it is like, I mean, when MLS franchises are going for $350 million, right? Like that is not the amount of money that you're going to be paying for an NWSL team. It's just not even in the same ballpark. So you're getting in on the ground floor of something, you know that probably TV money is going to increase, right? Like sponsorship money has already increased. Like you can see kind of the trajectory of this general thing. So it becomes again, like the same thing that we were talking about before. Like who are you getting into bed with when you're talking about these potential owners? What are their motives? And that I think is kind of the big part. I do think that we have now seen a really good couple of examples of independent ownership groups coming in. So it's not just going to be like, what MLS team do we want to bring into the fold, right? Because I also think that historically both Houston and Orlando as ownership groups have not been the strongest, and potentially both could be sold, and that could impact the NWSL team. Like those are both teams that we're kind of waiting and watching to see, do they end up in new ownership groups? What does that mean for the NWSL, right? So because MLS does kind of feel like it's just like you get this team and then you wait and try to like jack up the resale value, right? But now we do kind of have Angel City and I think Kansas City as two really good examples of what good invested ownership groups can look like that are interested in the NWSL first and foremost. And that I think is going to be an appealing kind of path forward. And so it's not just dependent on, and this is like probably a whole nother hour of conversation, but like, how much do you trust men's sports organizations to invest in women's sports organizations? And if we hit another pandemic and cuts get made, like, what goes on the chopping block first? Because it's not going to be their MLS team.
Right.
So
speaking of KC, we've got one more question for you, and it's from Haley. Sorry. How do you feel about Hugh Williams at KC?
I mean, I have not spoken to him a huge amount. I mean, I think that I do kind of wish that there was a little bit more of a process in Kansas City, but also they are on a ridiculous turnaround time. But I mean, it's always hard to take like one individual decision and then truly judge it in the greater picture. But I mean, there are so many conversations that we need to have about NWSL diversity in the coaching ranks, right? Like, are you British? Are you a dude? Are you British and a dude? Are you British and a woman, right? Like, how do we make the coaches of the NWSL maybe reflect some of the actual players in the league, right? Like, and this is it's not just NWSL that has this problem. But Hugh is, I mean, like, he's a community person, right? Like, he was working with Vlatko Andonovski for FC Kansas City. He's been in that community for basically his entire career. Like, he knows it well. And then the question becomes, is he going to be capable of leading an NWSL team on his own? And we're going to find that out live. But also Kansas City picking up a Utah roster that was not the best roster ever. And I think most will admit that, right? And then trying to tweak it in a very short amount of time, though there is a lot of allocation money in the NWSL for them. It's a tall ask. Like, I think, as we've seen in the past, like, sometimes you also do have to give people a chance to build, and that has not always. I know that we've got some Boston Breakers RIP, but like, I think about the people that they gave a long leash to and how that never worked out versus James Clarkson getting extra time at Houston to actually rebuild the team as he wanted it. And then what they did in 2020, like, we have seen both sides of it. So it's going to be hard to say, like, week one, if they're terrible, like, Hugh Williams shouldn't have been head coach. Like, it's going to take some time to get a better sense of if that decision worked out for them or not.
Well, Meg, we really, really appreciate you joining us. We even brought you on early because you were ready to go. We kept you on. We appreciate it. Before we get out of here with you, tell the people out there where they can find you and your work that you're doing at The Athletic.
Yeah, so I obviously write for The Athletic. The nice thing is that some stuff is going to be a little bit more unlocked, like the game post for SheBelieves Cup should all be unlocked and free to read, but also, we are a subscription-based site. And the nice thing is if you subscribe off of one of my stories, it is like legitimately like, oh, my money goes to the coverage of women's sports and shows that also should be invested in more, which is a conversation I have a lot. So please know that. But The Athletic, the podcast is always free to listen to. As well, which is also great. And then I also host a digital show every week that drops on Wednesday called The Fixture by WICC, but you can find me on Twitter at It's Meg Linehan. As always, I'm on there too much. So
you're one of the hardest workers in the biz. I really mean that. It's awesome. And you just celebrated a birthday last week. Hope that was
Thank you.
Terrific.
I actually celebrated it yesterday on my afternoon.
Your day off?
Yeah.
Good. Because I remember you posted a really in-depth article about the Spirit and their 9 million owners on your birthday. I was like, man, you didn't even get a break.
That was the entire day.
Yeah. So we appreciate you taking your time to be with us, and we'll see you down the road, my friend.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Take it easy.
Bye.
And as we say goodbye to Meg, just to let everybody know, we have an athletic discount. If you're a member, which all of you guys are because you're in here, go to the member portal, click on member discounts, and you can scroll all the way down. We have a discount link that is 50% off for an entire year. It's $30 for the year. So for me in DC, that's 3 beers. For some of you, it might be 4.5 or 5. Or if you live in Milwaukee and you drink Miller Lite, it's probably 15 beers. So it might be a little bit more for you. But for me, it's 3 beers. 3 beers a year. I can get The Athletic. It's great and definitely worth it because there are so many writers out there that are doing great work, and you don't want to be behind the paywall when something from The Athletic comes out that's important because it goes to the bone in depth. So definitely appreciate Megan coming on and hanging with us